operationalizing this concept of structural violence and being able to apply it to our public health practice. And so last week, 2 weeks ago, we had David Stovall, who came to talk to us about what he calls vertical structured violence, which I thought was a really helpful way of kind of advancing our concepts, where he really thinks about the intersection of the closure of schools and the destruction of people's homes and the law enforcement presence in communities as being an engineering conflict and causing harms for others. Okay, no problem. We're going to call IT and then we're going to solve this problem and then we'll be ready to go. We had Linda Ray Murray, of course, our first week, who did a wonderful job of kind of reminding us of our history and the fact that we've really been talking about structured violence since about the 1800s, despite the fact that our profession in public health has evolved to spend a lot of time working on individual behaviors and really operating acontextually, ahistorically. And we're trying to come back to our roots in public health. We also, Fernando de Mayo's paper really helped orient us to this risk of using this passive language as social determinants of health, and then really operating acontextually, ahistorically, apolitically. And in doing so, that makes us complicit in these violent forces. So I actually had a lot of fun just thinking about all that we've learned in a short amount of time. And this is just a way of me introducing our speakers this week. We're just really pleased that you made time for us, Kim and Juliana, because we've really been impressed. This is a student-driven course, so your names came up as people we want to learn from. And I know Kim's work in Chicago, and she's a master organizer and has been doing some really important things, so we're excited to learn from her. And Courtney, one of our students, is going to kind of formally introduce you, and then they'll have an hour to talk to us, and we'll have some time for questions and answers. And then our guests will leave, and our class, we have the People's Lobby coming here today to help us really work on organizing skills for public health, for health justice, for all the important work that we do. So Courtney.
Okay, so Kim is the executive director of the Little Village Environmental Justice Organization, LVEJO, where she has worked since 1998. Kim joined LVEJO as an organizer and helped organize community leaders to successfully build a new playground, community gardens, remodel of a local school park, and force a local polluter to upgrade their facilities to meet current laws. As executive director of LVEJO, she has worked with organizers to reinstate job access bus line, build on the recent victory of a new 23-acre park to be built on the Little Village, and continue the 10+ years campaign that won the closure of the 2 local coal power plants to fight for remediation and redevelopment of the sites. Mrs. Wasserman is chair of the Illinois Commission on Environmental Justice. In 2013, Mrs. Wasserman was the recipient of the Goldman Prize for North America. The biggest accomplishment to date is raising 3 community organizers ages 18, 11, and 8.
How's it going, everybody? Thank you for the introduction, by the way. Really appreciate it. And the age range is now 21, 13, and 10. Just FYI. Yes, a little old. So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kim Wasserman. Thank you very much for inviting us. We really appreciate it. And I would not be doing our organization and our work justice without having my co-director presenting here with me. So I was very excited when she was able to join me. Juliana Pino is our policy director, and I'll let her do her introduction.
Hey y'all, you'll hear a little bit more from me later in the presentation, but I am the policy director at LVEJO, and a lot of what I do is thinking about how structural violence came to be and how we can disrupt it now. So I'll keep it brief. So if you want to find out, stay in class.
Thank you. So I just want to make sure I properly introduced us, because we are we're a little different than most organizations. So I am the executive director, but I share my responsibility of director with 2 other co-directors. So Juliana is our policy director, and we also have a finance director who works with us. Because the reality is executive directing is the job of like 4 to 5 people at the end of the day. We don't have the luxury of having like a human resources department. We don't have the luxury of having a media department. We have a fundraising team now, which is all of us collectively put together. And we very proudly now have a policy team as well as an organization, which is a huge accomplishment for us as a board. So I'm going to go ahead and get us started. All right. Love Juliana, but she doesn't need to stand with me the whole time. I just want to make sure I introduced her. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our history and set up Juliana for the work that we're doing currently. But just to give you some understanding of our work, so I've been with the organization since 1998, the year my son was born. And as was mentioned, the reason I got involved in this organization was because when my son was born, he developed asthma at 3 months. And I wanted to understand what was in the air that we breathed and what was it that led him to having asthma as a baby. That led me down a very long road of now being the executive director at the organization I once started off as an organizer. I was very ambitious, and I wanted to understand more about the role non-for-profits play, particularly within environmental work. And please understand that when we started down this path, myself, the founders of the organization, the neighborhood that we work in, we didn't know that the work that we were doing was environmental justice, right? We didn't know that there was a term for the work that we were doing. We just knew that as parents, we wanted to protect our children. We just knew as parents that there was something wrong with the air quality in our neighborhood. We knew as parents that we deserved more park space in our neighborhood. We knew as young people that we should have more public transit in our neighborhood. But these things were not there. These things did not exist. Little Village on the southwest side, please feel free to come by anytime, has the youngest demographic, has the youngest amount of young people in its neighborhood, and had the least amount of park space in the entire city of Chicago for over 75 years. Right? So how we wanted to understand, like, that to us is environmental injustice, and we wanted to figure out how to change that. So, go ahead. So early on, our first, we do a lot of different projects, but our two biggest projects were particularly around shutting down the coal power plant, 2 coal power plants here in Chicago, Fisk and Crawford, and getting LVEJO Park built. So I'm going to talk a little bit about,
Test.
It might be a business. Thank you. Is that better? Ooh, look at that, I'm loud. Yes, okay. I'm normally loud, but damn, that's loud. Okay, so we do different work in different arenas. I can turn it down, okay. That one? Okay, thank you. I think we're good. So 2 of the biggest campaigns that got us the most notoriety, as I mentioned, was the closure of the 2 coal power plants in Chicago. So these are 2 coal power plants that we fought for 12 years to shut down. The city of Chicago was the last major metropolitan city that had 2 coal burning power plants in it. We knew in our neighborhoods that people were dying, 40 people a year in Little Village were dying prematurely because of the coal power plants. So it took us 12 years to shut down the coal power plants, but in 2012, we were successful and they shut down. And then in 2014, we were successful in being able to advocate for a new park in Little Village. As I mentioned, have the youngest population in the city of Chicago. Half of our population is under the age of 25, yet we only had 1 park in our neighborhood. So for over 20 years, people fought to get more park space in the neighborhood. Now understand that Little Village is very densely populated and also does not have a lot of open space. We don't have the luxury of saying, oh yeah, there's countryside, let's build parks. The only thing that was left in our neighborhood and continues to be left in our neighborhood is industrial properties. So industrial legacy, brownfields, Superfund sites. And so the park, LVEJO Park, is currently built on top of a Superfund site. It was remediated and downgraded to a brownfield, but the contamination is actually still under the park. So it wasn't actually taken out, and I should say it wasn't probably not remediated, it was kept as a space, and the park was built on top of it. And so these 2 campaigns really spoke to, 1, the perseverance of our community and knowing that something was wrong and wanting to right that wrong. 2, it spoke to the fact that people in our neighborhood know what's wrong and know how to fix it, right? It wasn't that folks needed to come in and tell us, oh, you know what your problem is you smoke in your home. Or, oh, you know what your problem is you have mold in your home. No, they recognized that they live in a highly industrialized community. They recognized that there was a lot of industry around them and they didn't understand necessarily what that industry put out and was that industry running to the best of its ability. And when you looked at the largest single source of pollution in our neighborhood, the coal power plant, it turns out that they were violating the Clean Air Act for many, many, many years. That in fact that they were overpolluting in our neighborhood. And actually, a lot of industry continues to overpollute in our neighborhood to this day, right? So, and that's not by chance. And so as an organization, we really came together in a different manner. We came together understanding people's assets. We came together understanding that people understood the problem, knew the solution, and that they could advocate for themselves. And in understanding that, and I think we forwarded some reading materials for folks to check out. I don't know if those got to be shared. But environmental justice is centered and runs off of 17 principles. right? So we work from a space that there are 17 principles that guide our work. We also work from a space of democratic organizing, so we follow the Jemez principles of democratic organizing. These are two documents that are incredibly important and incredibly grounding to the work that we do, because it speaks to the fact that in understanding what the solution is, there's also parameters in which we want to see those solutions carried out, right? So for instance, where that coal power plant was shut down 12 years ago, has it been 12 years? No, not yet. 7 years ago. Now, the city of Chicago has approved the building of a 1 million square foot warehouse, right? So what was once a source of air pollution is now going to once again become a source of air pollution. So this 1 million square foot warehouse, we can't even get a true estimate of how many trucks will be coming in and out of it, because there isn't anywhere, nowhere has there been built a 1 million square foot warehouse of this size anywhere in this area. So there is no true understanding of how many trucks we're actually talking about. Yes, the company went out and yes, they got consultants, and the number that they got back was 178 trucks. But the fact of the matter is the 1 million square foot warehouse has enough parking spaces for 200 trucks. So already that number doesn't speak to how many trucks actually this site will carry on it. Now, we're being told that this is a great thing, that converting a coal power plant to a 1 million square foot warehouse is a wonderful thing for our neighborhood, that this will bring jobs, that this will bring revenue into the neighborhood. And as a community who fought for open space, who fought for public transit, who fought for better air quality, we know for a fact that that's not what comes with the 1 million square foot warehouse. We know that what does come with it is diesel trucks that put out particulate matter, that cause respiratory illness in our families. We know that it causes safety issues for people walking across the street. 2 days ago, a 15-year-old was killed on 51st and Western by a semi-truck crossing the street at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Right? We know what those things bring. We also know that the jobs that people have in warehouses are some of the worst in the city of Chicago and in the suburbs. Right? We know that folks aren't getting paid well. We know that folks are being abused, their labor rights are being abused. We know the way they get paid is wrong. And we know that women particularly are being harassed in these spaces as well. These are the things that we're being told in our neighborhood are good, economic, solid things. And the worst part is that currently, the way the city looks at permits, currently the way the city looks at planning, they don't look at environmental health, they don't look at environmental justice, they don't look at labor conditions as part of the permitting process. And this is a huge problem for us in our community, because we understand that all those things fall in line together when dealing with industry and when dealing with planning in our neighborhood, particularly for industrial sites. And I will say that that's not just the case for Little Village, because you'll hear our aldermen say that we are against development, that we are not in my backyard, that we want no kind of development in our community, and that's not true. It's just that we understand what this type of development brings, and what it brings is much more health expense and cost than the actual good revenue of jobs. Right? And you don't even have to just look at our neighborhood. We can walk along I-55, the Stevenson Expressway, and you can go right down the road to the Damon exit in McKinley Park. They currently are fighting not just an asphalt plant that was built right across the street from McKinley Park. So an actual asphalt plant with, what's the name of the carcinogen? The polyaromatic hydrocarbons, literally 1,000 feet from a Chicago Park District and 5,000 feet from a grammar school. No thought given to putting an asphalt plant in the middle of the neighborhood, right? You keep going down, you go down, make a right on the Dan Ryan and go down to the hundreds, you end up in Alkill Gardens, right? The public housing project in Alkill Gardens, the home of the environmental justice movement. Hazel Johnson, the mother of the environmental justice movement, called Alkill Garden a toxic donut because they built the public housing project on top of unremediated land. Right? These people were exposed to lead on a daily basis living in the public housing projects, and then surrounded completely by a toxic donut. Industries surrounding them completely, with no thought given to air quality, land quality, water quality whatsoever. Right? And then if you go a little bit further west, you run into, same neighborhood, pet coke and piles of manganese. Right? An entire neighborhood that was a steel generating neighborhood now has piles of manganese and piles of pet coke, one of them being a neurotoxin, right? Just out in the open for their community to breathe in. And so across the city, we're seeing the consequences of not having, not just a justice lens, but environmental justice lens or a health lens in planning. And how we ended up here as an organization, just to give you a sense, is that when we won the coal power plant fight, and when we won the park, and when we won the bus, we were like, well shit, we're done. Right? We've done everything we set out we were going to do as an organization. We've got all these great things, and then we realized that in winning those things, the reality is that now our neighborhood had better air quality. Now our neighborhood had open space. Now our neighborhood had good public transit. And all of a sudden the city of Chicago, who gave, I swear a lot by the way, so I apologize. The city of Chicago gave no fucks about our neighborhood, right? All of a sudden was very interested in figuring out, well, let's start doing some planning. How do we get more homeowners into your neighborhood? How do we get, right? And we started to see the angle of gentrification and displacement coming into our neighborhood. All of a sudden, the city that wouldn't do anything in our neighborhood wanted to figure out, how do we start to rezone the industrial corridor? How do we ensure that the jobs here are really for folks in the neighborhood? And we were like, wow, all of a sudden now you want to have these conversations? What we want to understand is who decided that we didn't need a park? Who decided that it was okay to put these industries in our neighborhood? Who decided that we didn't need a bus line? That's what we want to know, is how were those decisions made? And in trying to understand those decisions, we found ourselves in the land of urban planning. Right? I'm not a planner by trade. I'm not a planner. I'm an organizer. That's what I do. I love organizing. That's my bread and butter. But I had to understand how planning played a role and what was it that was missing in the planning conversation for folks to be thinking about these things. And what we found what was missing was, again, the environmental health and environmental justice conversation, along with a lot of other justice conversations, but particularly in our case. Right? So how do we start getting folks to think about cumulative impact? How do we start to get folks to think about water quality, air quality, land quality? How do we start to get folks to think about, when they talk about gentrification and displacement, not just talking about homeowner protections, but renter protections? How do we talk about rising utility rates as part of the conversation that we want to have when folks talk about affordable housing? How do we talk about the fact that the new ARO that just passed for the city of Chicago for housing doesn't apply to Little Village? Because that's for units of 10 buildings or more. Most of the units in Little Village are only 2. Right? So how do you create programs? How do you create processes? How do you create policy, if you will, that actually protects our community and actually helps our community and doesn't, in fact, hurt our community at the end of the day? And so really it was at that point in time that we just realized that what we really lack is that policy arm, is that analysis arm to help us understand how do we go from just banging on somebody's front door that what you're doing is wrong and unjust and it needs equity lens and it needs alignment. How do we change that to actually develop the language? How do we change that to actually develop the processes that are just, that do allow us as community folks, as immigrants, as non-English speaking, as folks who are here with undocumentation? How do we exercise our right then to create policy from that framework to help our communities versus hinder them? Does that make sense to folks? So I want to stop there. Do folks have any questions? Because this is a conversation. This isn't just me talking about myself. Do folks have any questions? I just want to make sure that there's clarity, or folks want, please.
Did the warehouse project go through a permitting process?
It did. And no, so it did go through a permitting process. And there is what's called a sustainability matrix that the city has, in which there's a certain amount of trees that they have to plant. There's a certain amount of, what are the flooding things?
Bioswales.
The bioswales, oh Lord, right? They have to be solar ready. They don't have to put solar on. They just have to make their buildings solar ready, right? So there are things that they get points for and credits for helping improve the environment. Going to an electric fleet is not one of them. Putting filters in their diesel trucks is not one of them. How many trucks, an actual count of how many trucks is not one of them, right? Looking at how this is going to impact the local air quality in the neighborhood is not one of them, right? So what we've done as a neighborhood is we've taken it upon ourselves. So for the last 3 years, we've been doing air monitoring in the neighborhood because the city of Chicago has no clue how much particulate matter is in our neighborhood, but what they do know, what their recent studies have told them, is that we have the second worst air quality in the state of Illinois. Second worst air quality in the state of Illinois, and yet knowing their own planners put it in a report and gave it to their own people, and even knowing that, they still approved the 1 million square foot warehouse. Right, so there's an obvious disconnect when you're approving hundreds of trucks coming into a neighborhood that has the second worst air quality in the state of Illinois. Right, what is the disconnect that is happening that we're not even talking about? Can you show how you are going to improve air quality and not worsen it, right? Can you show how this project will not exacerbate current asthma conditions in the neighborhood, right? None of those things are currently required, and that's literally what we are fighting for right now, is to say, how does the city of Chicago get up to date with their permitting and planning process to actually start to think about mitigation, to actually start to think about what we call cumulative impact, to actually start to think about businesses not just coming into Chicago for the sake of doing business, but actually helping to improve the quality of life of our community residents. And not just, let me be clear, not just for the construction workers who are building the project, but for the people who are going to be left working in that building for the rest of the existence of that building as well. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to hand it over to Juliana.
So I apologize in advance. I don't curse any less than Kim does. I think it's one of the reasons why we work well together, right? Because this is some bullshit. Okay. So in bringing me on to LVEJO, I think some of what the organization was arriving at is a lot of what communities in Chicago are facing is that these decisions have been made way back in history, and we're living with the disproportionate burdens that those decisions are bringing to bear decades and decades later. And then also there are current decisions that are saying, hey, this is how the system is set up. We're just going to follow what the system is doing, and that makes us not complicit in perpetuating these terrible injustices because, in fact, these weren't our decisions. Does that make sense? You ever heard anybody say anything like that before? It's like, well, this is just how it is. It's like, I'm just doing the job, which is what we've been hearing from the Department of Planning for years now. Importantly, part of this is also how the city has been thinking about public health. So not just in the planning system, what they're doing is they'll have industry come in and they'll put up a slide and they have the picture of the site. All the area around the site is just like a white blank slate, which is just so symbolic on so many levels. But it's got like trees and the pretty building, and it's like, look, this is going to be great. And that's all they're saying, right? They're not saying, oh, this expanded facility of Unilever that makes all the mayonnaise some people like to eat is going to be right next to a primary school. And in fact, the dirty land that they're giving that primary school for their much needed expansion, unremediated by the way, is going to be the place where all the youngest students will be now housed, right behind where the trucks will be parking. The building expansion looks great though, and that's what's on the slide, right? That's what the Department of Planning is looking at when they're making these decisions. That's also what the Plan Commission is looking at. That is also what the Zoning Committee is looking at. And so you have all of these different bodies of decision making that are supposed to be putting into place a permitting process that makes sense and that is protective of the interests of different wards. But they're not actually doing that. Like the way it functions doesn't actually take any of these factors into account. And similarly in public health, folks for years have fought with the city to say, we don't want to just know how many people are smoking. We don't want to just know what your concern is around obesity and diabetes in communities where we know there are structural problems that are producing unequal outcomes. And in fact, if half of the community struggles with respiratory illness, that's not just because folks decided to behave in a way that put them at risk for that. Does that make sense? So a lot of what the city's public health department has done historically is to really blame people for the problems that they're having, including health problems. And that has been part of why it's been really difficult to ensure that there's integration between public health expertise and planning expertise that actually centers equity and really takes into account structural consequences. One thing that we knew as we started to research is that the city has these things called planned manufacturing districts. Has anybody heard about this? I see a few. I see a few hands. I see a few hands. What those planned manufacturing districts are essentially districts that are set up with specific geographic boundaries that are meant to facilitate maintaining the city as a manufacturing core. So the sort of policy goal here is to say, Chicago really thrives with a manufacturing base. We should be preserving that kind of industry, and let's lay out these particular areas with physical boundaries, and they're described by like this corner to this corner to this corner. These are the areas where much more manufacturing activity will be permitted by right. So this is where there sort of isn't a permitting process. So in these areas, even activities that would normally be considered really dirty are baked into the city code to say, if this activity is here, you can in fact do it. You don't need additional zoning changes. You don't need, it preempts you from a bunch of different other city processes that would normally be in place. And can you guess where those areas are? If you think about the neighborhoods that are impacted by any kind of environmental justice issue or structural violence issue, including over-policing, including poverty, these areas are predominantly in Black and brown communities, predominantly in really struggling neighborhoods, and there's a reason for that. There's anticipation that those neighborhoods won't fight back. There's this notion that Black and brown bodies aren't as valuable as more affluent white bodies, and it shows in the planning process. And so you then, on top of that, add in other structural forces that are at play: school closures, policing. You've heard from others in the series about how those issues impact communities. In communities like Little Village, the same students that don't have green space are also being over-policed in the industrial corridor, are also staring at Cook County Jail while they're trying to figure out how they're going to get to school because the 31st Street bus line was canceled because the city didn't think people used it. The community fought, by the way, to get that back. But does that make sense? So then you have all of these compounding issues that are being co-produced by the policy process. And a lot of what communities have said is, well, we're going to keep burning ourselves out fighting on a site-by-site struggle. We don't have a choice to do that in these neighborhoods. We're currently fighting the massive distribution facilities planned by this company named Hilco Global. They're in front of City Council right now trying to get approval for a Cook County tax incentive that would give them $20 million. Again, they're a global corporation. They paid $12 million for the coal plant site. So we have a little bit of a problem with someone being paid to pollute in an area that's already overburdened. It's not right, but the system is set up to reward those activities. As communities came together and started thinking through what cumulative impacts people were experiencing, we started to fight back through participatory data gathering. Kim mentioned some of the truck counting. We also started to look at, okay, if you try and combine a number of these factors into maps, how do communities show themselves? How does this look to others? If we're not just talking about, 97% of Illinois communities have better air quality than Little Village, but we're also talking about, and the community in Little Village, because of social and demographic characteristics, is more vulnerable to that pollution than other places, then it compounds the impact. Does that make sense? So you're not just dealing with the pollution super bad, you're also dealing with, and we have a lot of young people, and we have a lot of folks who don't speak English. We have a lot of people who, when they're experiencing health consequences, maybe can't afford to go to the doctor and are just trying to manage. Does that make sense? So all of those things combine to really describe what Kim was referencing as cumulative impacts. And in doing an analysis of the city, we began to understand, okay, this is really patterned. The policies have created these patterned outcomes. The impacts are really showing themselves. What's a way that we can actually address this at the root? And that is literally changing the planning, zoning, and public health policies of Chicago. So we and many other local organizations are running multiple campaigns to change how Chicago does its business. Because at the end of the day, these decision makers who don't care at all about what's happening in communities need to be held to account for the outcomes that they're producing. And this can't just be a sort of, let me wipe my hands clean because these decisions were made before me situation. Some of the decision makers are actively participating by approving incentives, by saying it's totally fine to give $95 million to build a cop academy. Those things are unacceptable if we think about who in Chicago is struggling the most and who also has the best ideas about how to use resources and policy to leverage a future that's actually just. So I think part of what you're seeing, both from LVEJO and a number of other groups in the city, is much more intersectional work than has ever happened in the past, connecting all of the dots between what's happening to communities. You see deeper collaboration in the policy process. You see groups who have never engaged in city council, groups that have never tried to do anything with legislation, banding together to be like, let's be staying up and looking at the rules of procedures so that we can figure out how to support folks to actually disrupt what's going on. If you are interested in seeing that firsthand, next week, Wednesday, 9 a.m., City Hall, the Cop Academy will be up for a vote. 2 votes, the contractor to build it, and the zoning approval to actually get it built. Hilco will be there trying to get their $20 million in tax money, and Lincoln Yards are also up for a vote, all on the same day. All on the same day at City Council. So if you want to see the decision makers passing this stuff through, come see it firsthand and support folks who are fighting to try and stop it, or at least disrupt it and say, this is not okay. It's not okay to behave this way and to routinely disregard the health, mental well-being, physical future of all of these communities in these ways. The other thing that we're doing is in Little Village and in other neighborhoods across the city, communities have these ideas that they want to make manifest, and there are also barriers in the law that make that really hard. So while the law has it set up such that if you're a big company, you have a lot of pollution, but you also have a lot of money, that's fine. The law has made it very hard for communities to say, oh, but we want a community land trust, or we want to run a co-op here, but co-ops aren't in Illinois law, what do we do? Or we would like to own our own solar panels. All of that is extremely difficult to achieve because the way that the laws are set up really concentrate power in the hands of corporations that have a lot of money. And that's sort of an underlying pattern, and it sort of doesn't matter what the behavior of those corporations are or what the public health consequences are, so long as they're able to pay to play. And that's one common thread through all of the different campaigns that I've mentioned, is that you're really seeing corporate power be confronted in a different way in Chicago, different than it has previously. Another thing I wanted to mention is that LVEJO became part of what it is due to youth leadership. And a lot of our youth leaders in the past worked not just on making sure that we were able to get green space, putting their bodies on the line to shut down the coal power plant, but they also did anti-militarization work in the community. They also did anti-police brutality work in the community. They're also fighting the immigration system at the same time. And a lot of what's different about environmental justice work from environmental work is that our work is inherently intersectional because we're really looking at the totality of the environment that folks are in, and we're responding holistically to all of these different impacts that are really colliding to make folks' lives, not what they're hoping they could be. And part of the work there, you'll see LVEJO working closely with anti-police brutality organizations led by Black young people, because part of what we recognize in our work is that youth are at the front of the work, and it's our responsibility as people who are no longer youth to support that leadership and to ensure that anything we do is intergenerational, because these solutions have been here for years, but actually making them real is going to continue to take a long time. And the folks who are going to be most impacted continue to be the young people in our neighborhoods. So part of what we also wanted to convey is that as you're thinking about what structural violence means, expertise doesn't necessarily lie with the folks who've had a lot of time to accumulate maybe what's in a textbook, but that folks' lived experiences and embodied experiences have a lot to bring to bear on the kinds of really technical, minute changes we need to see in order to produce different outcomes. And the best ideas we've had since LVEJO's policy program have started have come from young people and have come from people who didn't spend more than 8th grade in school. So that one of the things I wanted to make sure to say, because this is an educational institution and as somebody who has a lot of educational privilege myself, I'm often not the one with the best idea, right? Like folks in this room might not even be the ones with the best ideas. And we have to make sure to listen to the people who are most impacted, because in the No Cop Academy campaign, in LVEJO's work, the youth are the ones who are really bringing forward the kinds of changes that we need to see and are really pushing us to hold ourselves accountable to be organizing and doing policy work in a way that honors the lived experience that really at the end of the day is about those outcomes. Does that make sense? Yeah.
What is your experience and sense of your relationship with the Chicago Department of Public Health in terms of the equity issues and structural racism issues in the environment that you described?
Yeah.
Because they constantly are doing planning
for the
and prioritizing.
Yeah.
I'm just curious.
Yeah, so let me try and repeat your question. You asked, what is our relationship with the Chicago Department of Public Health because they're around the equity issues, because they're constantly planning and prioritizing, is that right?
Right.
Yes.
Yes.
So the relationship is complex. I would say we're frenemies. If it was a Facebook status, it would be it's complicated. The words I could say about the Department of Public Health. Okay, on balance, I think that there are a lot of really good people at the Department of Public Health trying to do the right thing, and they're baked into an institution that's set up to make that impossible. That's the truth. And I think there are a lot more good people there than used to be. I also think that when the Chicago Department of Environment was collapsed and all of those roles that the Department of Environment used to hold got sent out to other city departments, Department of Public Health had to absorb environmental inspections with no capacity, very little training, and no support from City Hall to actually do that job. So on one hand, I understand. That's shitty. How are you supposed to manage when you are literally given tasks that are not technically what you think is in your purview? Obviously, as we've talked about today, the issues are a little bit thornier to detangle. And because of the way that they've been getting their money and the kind of research they've been doing, they've really, again, focused on individual determinants of health. And at the end of the day, that does not cut it for communities who've been traumatized by violence, who keep getting dumped on by pollution, and who are being run roughshod over by City Hall decisions made by other departments. So they really are in a, what's the, people who paid attention to Greek history, the guy who pushed the boulder up the hill, Sisyphus. They're in a sort of like perpetual struggle, the people who are trying to do right, because they'll get the ball up the hill, and then the city just pushes it back down. However, we are on the eve of a new mayoral administration. How the city departments run has a lot to do with the direction from the 5th floor of City Hall. So we will likely see some changes, and I think that that's a big opportunity to change how the city does things. Yeah.
I have a question about, so I'm assuming you had hearings in Little Village for this development, right? Can you speak a little bit about how those hearings go in the city of Chicago and the outcome?
The hearings are not required when it's in a planned manufacturing district. So remember what I said about how people just get out of having to do things? That's one thing that they get out of having to do. It's voluntary by the company. We forced the company to have 2 community meetings, which went disastrously for them. They got shouted out of the room because people could see immediately this is really concerning. But yeah, they weren't required to have any hearings. We pushed to try and get many more, but they refused to do that. And in fact, in front of City Council, they said, oh, we did a ton of community engagement. Look at all these closed-door one-on-one meetings we had. What's that? 68. They said 68, right? They said they had 68 instances of engagement. Only 2 of those were public community meetings. Every other meeting on that list were closed-door private meetings with Little Village business owners, which is highly suspect, because who are you trying to avoid, right? Who is the community you're trying to engage? And so, yeah, in a different context, there may have been hearings, and that would have been a really good opportunity for the community to say, hey, these are our concerns. But in fact, even at the community meetings where the community tried to take the mic, they took a huge amount of time putting a presentation. They would cordon the meeting off to 2 hours, and they would spend an hour and a half presenting, and then be like, half an hour for questions, actually only 20 minutes for questions, actually we're leaving the meeting. So that's the kind of treatment, right, and disrespect that the community is receiving, and it's no surprise because the actual project is obviously deeply disrespectful. Yeah.
I have a question on actually being able to look at data on ambient air pollutants in the city of Chicago, Illinois, like by community area. Are there resources, like I'm using the EPA National Air Toxins Assessment to look at some data, but I'm wondering, do you know if any other resources we're looking at, like levels of, toxic heavy metals and things like that?
Yes, so the EPA's databases are probably the most comprehensive because they do the most monitoring, and they just updated that data. So now they're using 2014 data. The last update was in August. So if you haven't looked in a while, they have refreshed it.
Yeah.
They also have modeling data from their Department of Air that sometimes you can't access in the same way, and you might have to like call and dig a little bit more to get some of that. The CDC actually has some pretty good data on environmental health, and on occasion they also have samples that are more highly localized.
Okay,
So
CDC,
yeah, right? Yeah.
Okay,
That's
I
right.
knew about the EPA's tool, but I wasn't aware of
Yeah.
the CDC. Then
Yeah, oh, and one more thing. Some folks have also done their own independent air monitoring. In fact, folks in McKinley Park have been starting to buy these low-cost mobile air monitors, and by low cost, it's like low cost for them, but most community members cannot afford it. Still, it's like $250, which, is not thousands of dollars, but it's also like a lot of money. So there are some, and they're called purple air monitors, and they've installed them in a few places on the southwest side and the southeast side, and that's live monitoring data. So that's really interesting because that's like right now today, and you can like pull it up on your computer. We'll get the link to that. We can get that out to y'all so that you can see it. But yeah, so there's also like more localized data that has been collected that way. And then there's data that's been mandated through various processes that companies have had to produce for monitoring, but that data is much harder to get. And generally we try and FOIA for that data, Freedom of Information Act. Like this is data that's supposed to be public, but a lot of it comes back redacted. And so in terms of what's publicly available, EPA still has the best stuff, but check out CDC, check out the Purple Air Network.
And as far as you know, there's nothing by like Chicago community area or?
No, it's usually by zip code, and then they use modeling to get down to census tracts and block groups. Yeah. Yeah.
You mentioned that LVEJO is doing more intersectional work and working with different partners. What are some of the organizations in the city of Chicago that do this environmental justice or this intersectional work?
Yes, oh my gosh, there's so many. Ready? Oh, did I turn this off? Did I turn this off? I'll talk loud. So there's so many. In terms of frontline environmental justice groups, People for Community Recovery and Altgeld Gardens, key group. You have the Southeast Environmental Task Force on the southeast side. They're based out of Hegewisch, but they also cover multiple neighborhoods in that area. You have the Southeast Side Coalition to Ban Petcoke. You have Friends for Environmental Justice in McKinley Park. You have Blacks in Green in Woodlawn, Kenwood, border area. You've got Ixchel, they're in Cicero, and that's spelled Ixchel. They're in Cicero, but they're right on the border of Little Village, and a lot of our planned manufacturing district issues impact them. That's frontline environmental justice work. I would also point folks to Clean Power Lake County. They're in Waukegan, but they have an active coal plant that's still there. That's a problem. Their community is very similar to Little Village, and so we do a lot of cross work with them to support them in their campaigns for closure. In terms of other groups that are supporting this work, we're in like deep work with Asada's Daughters, with American Friends Services Committee, with most of the core organizers for No Cop Academy. No Cop Academy isn't an organization of itself, but it's got 101 endorsing organizations, and so we're in constant collaboration across organizational boundaries there. And then we also do work with some environmental groups on other parts of our work. So depending on what we're talking about, right? We, for example, collaborated with the Natural Resources Defense Council to do a scan based on a scan that EJ groups had started to do of what are all the municipal policies that have ever been passed on environmental justice? Like, how can we start to address what's happening at City Council? What's been done in LA, in Newark, right? You collaborated with them to commission that study. So it totally depends on what we're working on, but definitely the frontline groups are our closest partners because those are accountable to community, run by community members, and ultimately at the end of the day, like that's the front of the front of where decision making should be happening on these issues. It should be community residents, and it should be people who are impacted by them daily.
I live on 31st and Pulaski, so I'm really familiar with all the stuff
Know it well.
that you've been talking about, and that I've attended some events that LVEJO has hosted in the past. It kind of got me wondering about specifically around how do you, like, well, you talked a little bit about like mobility justice and like the fact that more drops makes walking communities more vulnerable.
That's right.
And I can see just like by living in Little Village, sometimes like the lack of power kind of makes people distant in as far as like being able to be like empowered and mobilized to participate.
That's right.
So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about like how you mobilize communities that might maybe feel like, you know, disadvantaged or disattached. But also I was kind of thinking a little bit, sorry, two-part question, but I just wanted to also ask about, the first part is about mobilizing community, and the second part is about how do we like commodify healthy lives as something valuable to the city of Chicago, since at the end of the day, revenue is more important than the quality of lives of brown and black people.
Really good questions. I think, Kim, you'd be really well suited to talk about the first one. But for us, it really comes down to the thing that you're identifying, self-determination, like the awareness that you actually have a role to play in a change is incredibly motivating, but that really takes a long-term commitment in not just organizing, but like relational development with folks, to be in the work with them and to share what we have access to, the knowledge we have access to, so folks are like, oh damn, I didn't know, right? Like I knew I was struggling in this particular way. I didn't know that was a result of this other thing. And to really allow folks to decide for themselves, like, does that mean I want to take action about this? So that's also different in terms of what we do versus what some other groups do, is we're not in the business of forcing people to do things. We're in the business of supporting people's education about what's going on and to facilitate as best as we can to support them to get involved, but not to dictate what they should be doing, nor to say you must anything. And Kim can add on a little bit more about that. And then we can answer the other thing.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So yeah, to Juliana's point, it's really about, compared to most other organizations, we spend a lot of time getting to know folks. So we don't go to people's doors being like, hey, I'm here to get you to fight Unilever, or hey, I'm here to get you to fight the coal power plant. We actually don't talk to people about our work for probably the first 2 to 3 meetings that we have with them, because it's really about getting to know what the person is, why do they live in Little Village? Why do you live here? What do you like about it? What don't you like about it? What do you have going on? Right, like what are you concerned about? What's important to you? What are you good at? And we spend a lot of time just getting to know folks, because the reality is folks have a lot of things going on, and coming to their door with another problem is not what we're in the business of doing. Right, like if I just want to get people to come out for the sake of doing that, I can work for a lot of other organizations. What I want to make sure of is that when people come out, they understand why they're there. They have consented to being there, and they are there because it's important to them, not because somebody gave them a free shirt, not because somebody hooked them up with a free lunch, not because somebody told them like, hey, get on this bus, get a shirt and get lunch, and go yell at the mayor. Right, like, oh shit, I'll go yell at the mayor any day of the week, but why are you yelling at the mayor?
I'd get on that bus.
Right.
I'd be like, yes.
Right, so it's really about, through that conversation, understanding what's important to people, and at the end of the day, figuring out if anything that's important to them is connected to the work that we do, and if it is, how do we build that, and if it's not, can we help folks, and if not, being honest about that. And for a lot of our folks, honestly, it's a question of just being heard. Right, like how many of y'all had somebody come to your front door and just simply ask you, how you doing? Right, like how is your life going today? Right, like where are you at? Right, like
you're sleep deprived.
Right, so it's really about changing, having a different mindset of why you organize. And that's something that I think we're really proud of, that makes us very different from most other organizations, to be honest. So hopefully that answers your question. What was the second question?
Modifying healthy lives.
Shit, that's what we're in the, look here. Look, so I think part of it is understanding, right, that this is a structural problem. And I think for us, part of it is in fighting for the fact that, how do we change the narrative that the city doesn't care about Black and brown lives, right? And for me, just like we don't put a price to the air we breathe, and we don't put a price to clean water, and we don't put a price to clean land, we don't put a price to folks, right? It's about how do we start to actually understand that folks do have value and fight for our own value, right? One of the biggest questions we ask folks is what is power and who has power, right? Because the perceptions that folks have of who has that and who doesn't is part of one of the biggest problems that we face in our communities, right? And it's through that context of our young people understanding that they are valuable, that they do deserve clean air, that they do deserve these rights, and flexing that right at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I would just say questions about commodification shouldn't be directed at me because I hate capitalism. I'll just come out and say it. I hate it. We're in the late stages of it. It needs to die. Anyway. But you're right that the city is more responsive to messages about money than it is to any other messages. And part of what I think you're seeing in a lot of social justice focused campaigns right now is really calling out the hypocrisy in their focus about money. Example number 1. Closures of 50 schools during the Emanuel administration was justified, routinely and regularly justified, because they did not have the money. That was what the city said. We have a pension crisis. We don't have the money to work with these schools to stay open. We don't have the money to fix their roof problems, to deal with asbestos, to support students to finish their programs. Better just close them. Same argument used for closing mental health clinics, if y'all remember that, if you were here at the time. We don't have the money. And yet, they're spending $4 million a day on policing. And yet, you see them giving millions of dollars in tax incentives to Lincoln Yards, right? When they want the money, they'll pull it out from somewhere. It's that they don't value spending the money on the things that communities across Chicago, even those communities that aren't thinking about this along racial disparity, even those communities that don't have any skin in the game in terms of where they are, can see that it's fucked up, right? And then when you combine that with a system that says, well, tax incremented financing says some of these areas are drawn around so that even property tax money isn't going to go to local schools, that's also a money problem. And so the city keeps trying to say, well, we really need more jobs, we need more development. And we see that as a revenue producing situation for the city. But where does that revenue go is something that folks are really calling out and calling into question. Even when you do engage with them on questions of revenue, like, for example, it'll cost $331 million to cover the asthma and respiratory illness visits for every family in Little Village over the lifespan of this tax incentive. It's a lot less money to just make the company pay for that than giving them a $20 million discount. But that's not going to happen, right? Because that inherent lack of caring about the value doesn't even extend past monetary arguments. Because it shows in how they balance the books. And frankly, like it's set up to really concentrate money in the hands of specific developers and certain law firms that support those developers to lower their property taxes or making the most money. And then the other focus is trying to bring mega corporation headquarters here, as you all probably noted with the big courting Amazon campaign, right? Amazon got kicked out of New York City because that was a bad deal. And yet, on the same day, the governor and the mayor wrote a letter to say, hey, consider us again. So it's really clear where their priorities are. You know, you have Crane's Chicago business saying, well, we can't say no to Lincoln Yards because that'll send a bad signal to all other commercial developers that, like, we don't want a bright future in Chicago. A bright future for who, right? Like, we're living in a city that's actually multiple cities. And so long as those monetary benefits accrue to the cities that are in power in Chicago, then that's all good. But if there's disruption of that power, that's where you see these difficulties, right? Their hypocrisy starts to be laid bare. Yeah.
Question.
Yeah.
I've lived in Little Village for about a year. So I kind of been around all over Chicago, so I've seen how, just visually, how it's just so different compared to just looking at the area. But my question is for, in terms of like pushing for like justice, is there like, I feel like if it's already, has there been like evidence-based research that's showing that this is affecting these communities? Like, how is it even like legal for them to like put these industries into this is like violating like the Clean Air Act and things?
Right. Really good question. So this wonderful person was wondering about, like, if there's evidence about these consequences, how is it legal for these companies to do this? Answer number one to that is part of what we think about is as environmental justice issues. It's not just the, like, some communities get left behind in terms of where things are cited. So it's not just the disproportionate citing, it's also the unequal enforcement of environmental laws. So where there are laws, some people get protected by those laws and other people don't. The coal plant in Waukegan, Latinx community, has been running for 9 years without an operating permit. Those are required to run. You are not supposed to be running things or producing electricity in that manner without an operating permit, and yet they just get to do it. Because the city, the state, city of Waukegan, the state don't prioritize enforcement on them. They're just like, oh, we have these other people to enforce on.
For 9 years.
There are laws in place to protect them, and there's evidence about respiratory illness there too, and they're just ignoring it. So that's one answer, is that like the regulations that exist are just not equally applied. The other answer is that the regulations are written to minimize procedural interventions by members of the public. So you see corporations at the state trying to eliminate what's called standing. So the ability of an individual member of the public to say, I've been harmed by this. I have the right to sue you because you're violating the law. They're trying to interfere with that right constantly at the state legislature. They're also trying to interfere with people's right to protest, right? There are a number of bills in many different state legislatures, including one in Illinois right now, to criminalize protest. So not only are they saying, well, we have laws, but we're not going to enforce them equally, but also they're saying, and you can't say anything about it. And also they're saying, and we're not going to afford you an opportunity to intervene to change the law or change the decision. So that's part of what we're seeing is like there's plenty of evidence. And in fact, that evidence extends to like psychosocial stressors, like people have mental health consequences of living with environmental harm. We have evidence coming out of LA about how diabetes is exacerbated and in some cases highly catalyzed by exposure to certain kinds of particulate pollution. The evidence is there. It's just that decision makers don't have to pay attention to it. And it's not incorporated in the foundation of the policies themselves. And even when it is, those policies aren't equally applied. And if that doesn't make you mad, whew, I don't know what else would. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
In terms of, I'm sorry, pardon me?
Yeah.
In terms of what you guys are doing to change the city's policy,
Yeah.
Obviously that's part of your job, right? So are you submitting, what is the process, I guess, that you are engaged in the city in order to start moving that policy forward? I mean, are you going through the aldermen? I mean, what does that look like?
Oh, if only. Our alderman, our current alderman, if anybody wants to look him up, Ricardo Munoz, just came back to city council to approve that tax incentive to go through, but had not been there for a few months because he's a horrible human being, and he had a personal situation in which he was exposed as mistreating his wife, and refused to resign. So there you go about power.
And came out of rehab just for
to approve that tax incentive.
Just for the tax.
Yeah. So he's not a recourse, in short. What's that? Yes, and the question was, what are we doing policy-wise to actually make the changes? Are we working with our alderman's office? The answer is no on that. We may see changes, and the changes that we would need to see would be to Chicago City Code, and so in order to see those changes, we have to go and write legislation. That would pass through City Council. Now, this is going to take a long time. We have a sense of what changes are needed. Changing the planned manufacturing districts is part one. Mandating environmental and public health concerns be factored into the permitting process for a number of different kinds of industrial sites is part two, right? There are a number of different versions of that need to be changed. It's like really apparent what the changes are. However, this is fundamentally a threat to something that folks may have heard about, I don't know, called aldermanic prerogative. Yeah, I see some nods. So if you see the wards as little fiefdoms, which is how some of the alder folks treat them, that's one of the powers that they have that City Hall doesn't necessarily have, which is to say, if this is in your ward, whatever this site is, you can ultimately say, I do or don't support it to move forward. And changing the zoning process to be more strict takes less control, requires less control from aldermanic offices. And so it is seen as a direct threat from their ability to say, yes, I want this mega development, yes, I'll take these campaign donations from big developers, and yes, I'm fine with it polluting everybody else. And yes, I'm also going to retire and not live in this neighborhood anymore, and so it's fine. So that's the short version. It's legislation. It's straight up, we have to make sure that City Council reflects the wants and needs of residents of Chicago who want to see something different. In the last election, you started to see some of that. You saw no fewer than 5 socialist candidates. I mean, that's unprecedented in Chicago, unprecedented. You have 13 runoffs and a mayoral runoff. So you're clearly seeing in a number of different neighborhoods, people are really fed up. Their rents are going up, they're being displaced left and right, and at the end of the day, where the power over those decisions lies is with aldermanic offices and the mayor. And so we're going to be moving forward on pushing for legislation, and it might take some time, and it might be a needle here, a needle there. But ultimately, we're in a totally different place than we were a few years ago. We've started to see the Department of Public Health consider some cumulative impacts, right? They're starting to do their own work around that. That's unprecedented. So little by little, I think, we'll start to see some cooperation, wanted or not wanted, and that's ultimately what we're going to have to do is change the law. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Evelyn. I grew up in Little Village, but was pushed out because of gentrification. But I still care about what happens in Little Village. I don't know. I walked in a little late. I don't know if you mentioned the Paseo that's going on, and I was wondering if LVEJO has any say in the proposals for the community benefits agreement that I think is being trying to be pushed through. I'm not sure if there's been any progress on that.
Yeah, really good question. So the wonderful person who raised the question noted that they were a resident of Little Village, but were pushed out because of gentrification. We're asking about the El Paseo Trail. Has anybody heard about this? I see some nods. There were pushes, there are still pushes to have a community benefits agreement around the development of that trail, and to have that community benefits agreement include certain provisions, and they were wondering if we could give an update on that and on LVEJO's stance on that. I think LVEJO, generally speaking, is really concerned about El Paseo because the city co-opted an idea, actually, that came from community residents in Pilsen and Little Village because they were like, we want a bike trail, and look, there's this abandoned rail line, maybe we could use this, right? The city was like, great, the new 606, we can't wait, yoink, right? And then they started planning for it. Like, that's literally how it went down. It was bananas. They started incorporating it into their planning documents, hired people inside of the Department of Planning, and they've decided, right, they're gonna move ahead, this will be a crowning jewel, this will be a chance to do things right, except we know multiple people are working on El Paseo and the Department of Planning, they're not even talking to each other. They're like not even coordinated. They're working on adjacent blocks and they don't even talk to each other. So that's a problem. And I think we really support the idea that there would be an agreement that would hold the development to rent controls, to making sure that people's housing is taken care of adjacent to El Paseo, to making sure that like even further out, there should be like requirements on the kinds of actually affordable housing, not just affordable housing by the city definition, which is not affordable for most residents of Little Village, right? And some residents of Pilsen. All of that is well and good. We're really concerned that the plan itself will still have issues, even if there are those things. So we're concerned that like it's not going to be planned and rooted in community vision, that even if they do minimal right housing requirements, that's not going to be enough. There needs to be way more, right? The like bar is too low for what they've committed to, and you already see the city starting to co-opt some of the like fair housing language in the Affordable Requirements Ordinance. Kim mentioned that, the ARO. They made it sound really good, but it has all of these carve-outs that make it not apply to the people who are most vulnerable, especially people who are in the parts of Little Village, which is 60% renters, by the way, who will like be the first ones, right, to lose their homes. And it's like if the policies don't actually address, or agreements don't actually address the houses, the specific residents that are most at risk, it's still going to displace people. So we're really concerned about the project generally, right? Like when it was like an idea that came from community members, when it looked like it could be community driven, that all sounded good. But as soon as the city put their sights on it, it's a huge risk. We're really concerned about what that will mean gentrification wise. Yeah. But we support any kind of agreement that puts requirements on them. We just think they should be like way more strict, right? Yeah. Last question?
What do you think we can do to support LVEJO? And after we know maybe student, I know exactly what you're talking about, but we the students can support LVEJO. And maybe send information to us about events you have, and we can maybe participate.
Do you want to take this one? Next one.
So, I did. So there's a couple of things. I think that the way folks can support not just our organization, but I think the work across the board is, one, continuing to have these conversations. I think you would be surprised to know that we have been banging on the door of public health. There's a couple folks here who we've been trying to talk to over the years to say, how do we bring this conversation to bear? Because we even as an organization understand, right, the planners and public health folks are coming out of this institution. Many of our young people from our neighborhood come to this institution. So how do we start at the place where folks are getting the knowledge? How do we start at the place where folks are getting this critical thought process?
Also a structure.
Also a structure, absolutely right. So for us, it's one, how do we continue these conversations and how do we continue to build with community in a manner that's not extractive, right? In a manner that's not transactional. And that's what historically has been the relationship for a lot of our groups on the ground with universities. It's been extractive, it's been transactional. And really what we want to be able to do is build equity and build alignment, what we call building equity and alignment. How do we build alignment with institutions like this? Understanding each other's limitations, but being able to bring conversations like this, right, to bear on city processes, to bear on what is happening in the city of Chicago. I think too, coming out to support everybody and anything from like fighting Hilco to the No Cop Academy and being able to make those bridges. One of the biggest things we not suffer from, but one of the biggest obstacles we have with a lot of our partners is when we talk about environmental justice, we're talking about racial justice. We're talking about supporting our young people on the ground, and when people don't want to talk about, well, our No Cop Academy is a whole other conversation. If we can't have that conversation, then we're not having a conversation, right? Like you either take us for our whole, or we're going to have to agree not to not get down with each other. And I think that's what we're looking for, is to say we want a partnership, but based on values. We want a partnership that's based on building with each other and not just, well, let me just drop some dough on you, you all do a project and we call it a day. Right? Like that's not what we're looking for anymore. And I think we're also just wanting for folks to be able to come into communities in the right fashion. Many times you'll hear us in our presentation telling people to come correct, right? Like, you know, they call us the bubble busters for a lot of folks because, right, folks, they're like, oh, but I want to come volunteer at your organization. All right, have you checked your privilege? Have you understood, right, what it is that you carry? Are you coming to have a savior moment, or are you coming to put your skills to use? Are you coming to tell me how I'm wrong and tell me that I need to work on your ideas? Or are you coming to say, hey, here's my skill set, how can I help you? Right? Those are the conversations that we want to have with folks, because I've spent a lot of time in this organization with students from other institutions that I will not mention, right, who come into our organization for summer-long projects, and I'm having to have conversations on like why you don't tell people to move on my sidewalk. You know, as a tall young white person, you don't just like move out the way. Oh no, like you move out the way. Like you see women coming on the block, you move out the way from the women on my block. But women on my block are not moving out the way for you. Right, like don't. Like, so how do we have? How are folks coming into our community understanding? Right, how do I help? Right, and not just coming for their own personal agenda. So I think those are the things we really wanted to, I think, share with folks about what we're looking for. And I think just we're looking for good, honest partnerships in which we can work with each other and support each other. Because the fact is that we're finally here. Right, after 20 plus years, we're finally here. We're finally in this space. We're finally able to have this conversation. And I, for one, don't want to see us, what's the brother with the rock? I don't want to see us coming down the hill with the rock, right? I'd like to see us, that brother, I'd like to see us going over the hill with the block, with the rock thing, yeah, whatever, yes. So that's what I have to say.
Yeah, I would add and echo what Kim said, and part of it is that like recognizing that communities have also been burnt by folks coming to do help that are actually just like coming to study people like they're lab rats, right? It's like we are not polar bears in a zoo. Like, it's not cool to come and just, like, be like, poke, like, oh, I see what's wrong, right? Like, that's not okay. But a lot of people are trained, disciplinarily trained, that that's how you get to the evidence. And so it's really also about questioning the depth of that indoctrination, right? I've had to learn and unlearn a lot of the things I learned in school, right? I spend as much time unlearning as I do learning. And that's a fact, and that's me, right? I'm in this work every day, but you have to recognize, like, that stuff gets in deep, and you have to really question, like, these ideas that I have, where did they come from? And am I actually executing my actions in a way that aligns with values that are not about, like, what I'm told is fine, but what I believe is fine, and from listening to people who are most impacted by the issues I care about. At the end of the day, like, is this serving them? Am I adding value, right? Am I getting in the way? Something I ask myself all the time, right? Would me being there get in the way? And so I think ask yourself questions and be ready to listen, right? Like here or anywhere else. That's an important part of doing the work that's required, I think, to be in struggle with people in an authentic way. With folks in La Vita, with folks in any other community in Chicago that are, frankly, doing badass things, right? To fight back and to create a different future. Take that leadership, right? I've got a lot to learn from people, and I feel like everybody in this room has a lot to learn from people, and approach things with that venue, right, at the front. Like, this is a place where I learn, and it'll be a lot harder to go wrong. Does that make sense? But yeah, generally speaking, watch our social media pages. We use social media a lot now because young people are about that life and we're about young people, and so we're trying not to be ancient.
Trying.
I got really good at Twitter this year. I'm so proud of myself. But then all the youth were like, we only use Snapchat now, so now I'm like behind. But yeah, but I noted it earlier. Next possible opportunity to show up for folks in person, Wednesday, City Hall, 121 North LaSalle, 9 a.m. press conference and rally, 10 a.m. City Hall meeting. You'll see that they have a cap of 10 speakers on every issue for the whole meeting, 10 speakers total, 3 minutes each. So, 30 minutes of public comment on every issue on the agenda, which is very few, as you noted from earlier. So come see how the city's process works and support the incredible young people that have been leading those campaigns from the beginning. Yeah.
Thank
All
you
right,
so
that's
much.
it. I swear I turned it off and now I want to turn it off.
So we're going to thank our guests who joined us.
Maybe it
and we're
needs
going to take a 10-minute break and then